Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We are here with episode 2 with Dr. Heath Hagy of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Wildlife Refuge System, waterfowl ecologist here in the Southeast region. Heath, welcome back.
Thanks, Mike.
We are going to resume our discussion about different plants that people are going to encounter in wetlands and what their different values are to waterfowl. If you did not catch episode 1 related to this little 2-part series, I certainly encourage you to go back and listen to that. It should have been released just a few days ago relative to this one, and that will provide you with a background on all of this, why we study plants, why we care about what waterfowl eat and from which plants they find these foods. In that previous episode, Heath broke down all the plants that are out there that we care about or that we would encounter into these 6 different categories: the aquatics, both emergent and submerged, broadleaves, grasses, sedges and rushes as one group there, vines, and then trees and shrubs. And then actually there's another one that I will be talking about today. It's cultivated crops and their value for waterfowl. On the previous episode, we only got through that introduction and the history of food habits and then through the aquatics. There's a lot to talk about with that one. That's an exciting group. So today we're going to pick up with our broadleaf category. What is that, Heath? When we say broadleaf, what other names would people might know that group of plants as, and what are some examples?
Yeah, I think maybe folks would find some examples the best. So we think about large, literally broadleaf plants in this category. Things like smartweeds and coffeeweed and just a variety of different species. When most people think about these in their garden, they're just weeds, but oftentimes those are very good duck food, and so that's what we may be managing for. In general, this category has some plants that are very good seed producers if they're annual plants, meaning they've got to grow from seed every year. Although many of these species may be perennial, meaning that they last for year after year after year, they don't necessarily grow from seed every year, or they may be able to have both life forms as well. The annual broadleaf plants tend to, again, produce good numbers of seeds and be fairly desirable. The perennial species, the ones that grow year after year, put more of their effort, into the vegetation production. They don't produce the seeds, which are eaten by waterfowl, and so they're not as good as some of the others. As far as from an energy standpoint, it's really a mixed bag. We have some species that are quite good, produce a lot of food, have good energy values. We have some others that are not good. Either they really aren't consumed very often by waterfowl, or the energy value when they are consumed is not very good.
Cocklebur would fall into the category of one that is not good and we all hate.
And is not consumed as far as I know of in any diet studies.
And dogs with long hair certainly hate them.
That's right.
Right? Yeah, there are a lot of different plants, I guess kind of classes of plants that fall into this category that people are going to know about. Smartweed is one,
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of different species
Mm-hmm.
in smartweed. We'll get to that here in a second. The first thing that I wanted to ask you about is the general kind of soil moisture requirement of this group of broadleaves. And the aquatics, obviously, as you described previously, they're the ones we think about that have to have their, quote, feet wet
Mm-hmm.
all year long. What about broadleaves? Is that a pretty large gradient in terms of their soil moisture requirement?
A huge gradient, yep. But generally, we're coming up in the landscape. We're coming toward upland and out of the permanently flooded or semi-permanently flooded area during the growing season. So we often get most of these broadleaf plants in areas that at some point during the growing season the water recedes from. Either we, in a managed impoundment, we draw the water off or pump the water off, or naturally, a river in a floodplain situation, the river, maybe after a spring flood recedes, and then you get this flush of broadleaf plants that comes in behind them. Some of these species need really warm soil temperatures and can do well in very hot weather, like cocklebur or like sesbania. Others, do better early in the season when the soil temperatures are cooler, like some of our smartweed species.
Some of the species in this group would fall into the other category that we talk about a lot as moist soil plants,
That's right?
And so we could have taken that approach in this conversation where we would have we could have categorized this as emergent wetlands, moist soil wetlands, flooded bottomland hardwoods, right? That would have been another way that we could have approached this conversation. But I just wanted to mention that to clarify that some of these groups that we are going to talk about, certainly in this category, as well as the grasses and sedges to follow, and maybe even some of the others, could fall into that quote moist soil category, or maybe even into the emergent wetland category when we talk about some of the perennial smartweeds, right?
Absolutely. And in your average wetland, you often have all of these species or representatives from each one of these groups that we've talked about, in your wetland. So in a managed impoundment near the water control structure, you generally have some of those, maybe not SAV, but arrowhead, cattails, you have some of those aquatic species. And as you move away, you sort of move up the gradient to where it's drier sooner, or it gets drier overall in the summer. Then you're moving generally through some of your broadleafs and into your grasses and some of the other species.
We're going to go through a couple of species here, or at least species classes. Maybe I'd just say genuses. Is that the plural or is it general?
Close enough for me.
So, and to give people some specific examples that they would be familiar with, we're going to talk about those. The first one is going to be smartweed, Polygonum. There's, I don't know how many different species of Polygonum. There's at least half a dozen or more that y'all have in that book that we talked about on the previous episode. Are all smartweed species the same in terms of their food value? Their food value.
No, and it gets more complicated than that, unfortunately. They're not all the same, and they're not all the same for different duck species as well. So every duck species, is physiologically and physically equipped to sort of handle different size food items better or worse than other ones. Mallards being a large example, green-winged teal being, an example of a species that can handle very, very small seeds. It depends who's the forager and what they're eating on, for instance. There is some variation in, for instance, if we pick one species, a good broadleaf species like Pennsylvania smartweed, what some people call it pink smartweed, bright pink.
Fairly large size seeds right? Within the smartweed family.
Exactly right. Grows in the midsummer. You can see these, lots of bees out over a wetland, lots of pink flowers. That's generally, going to be pink smartweed or Pennsylvania smartweed. That's a very large seed, very good for something like a mallard, probably not as good for something like a green-winged teal or blue-winged teal. They're just not as equipped to handle it. But a very good species. So that's going to be roughly a similar, so if you're only feeding that to a mallard, roughly a similar energy value to something like nodding smartweed or Polygonum laptifolium. That's going to, the laptifolium may have a slightly lower TME or energy value, but really the biggest difference comes across the consumer species, so across duck species that are going to consume it.
Is there an easy way for people to know whether they're dealing with a species of smartweed that's valuable as a food item or is not very valuable? Because aren't there a couple that just we don't know them to be highly consumed by waterfowl? And maybe there's some that I've encountered in the wetlands that I was out in this past weekend. I mean, it's everywhere. But when you look at the seed, the quote seed, it actually looks just like remnant of the flower. There's nothing in there. It looks like there was no seed production whatsoever. So I guess I'm bad about this. I asked you two questions there. One is there an easy way for people to know if they're dealing with a smartweed species that is of value? I'll ask you the second one again here in a minute.
As soon as I give this answer, somebody's going to prove me wrong. But in general, I'm going to go back to that annual versus perennial. If in part of your wetland that you go hunt in or you manage, you have the same species every year, no matter what, pretty much at the same density of smartweed, that's probably a perennial, and it's probably not very good for waterfowl. If you have what looks like different species and they grow differently, and that's a smartweed, I'm not sure what's there, but that was something else last year, that's probably one of the better ones. That means you've got, annual plants, they're coming up and they're senescing, and then something may come in next year. So species like Pennsylvania smartweed and nodding smartweed, those are two of my favorites, two of the ones that we have the information on to say these are really good species for a wide variety of waterfowl as far as energy. And it's a good broadleaf plant, meaning there's a lot of plant material there, so it's going to be good invertebrate production, good for invertebrate production as well in those wetlands in the winter and in the spring.
I don't like the direction that answer took relative to the way I'm thinking about the wetland that I was in this past weekend and what's in that wetland, because it's not a monoculture across the board, but it's dense, smartweed. Now, I guess on the good side of things, there's a lot of vegetation there. There's a lot of structure, which gets to the invertebrate component of it. But talk about the type of smartweed that I likely have there.
Probably swamp smartweed, or I'm gonna say water smartweed. There is a water smartweed, but there are several different species that we lump together that grow very similarly. So the swamp, and actually there are a couple of different species that we throw together to represent swamp smartweed. Anyway, getting out of the technical details there, the swamp smartweed and the water smartweed, they grow in very wet conditions. So they're going to be, again, like down by your water control structure, in the borrowed ditches, along pond shorelines, lake shorelines that have water on them throughout at least half their growing season or all of the growing season before that water comes back down, in areas where you generally don't see a lot of disturbance, mechanical disturbance. So they if you disturb it over and over again, they generally have a tough time competing with those annual species. So that's probably so I'm probably describing where you're hunting there,
that's
Mike,
right.
for the listeners.
Yes, but probably really good from a wood duckling habitat standpoint, right?
A lot of cover there, so it's probably got some cover, probably similar to buttonbush or something else.
Yeah.
Lots of cover there, and so probably good for ducklings, but not much seed there. And that's again going back to this perennial thing. The perennial species, they don't have to produce much seed,
so they're not investing. So those plants are not investing much in the seed production, which is why that when I pick up what looks to be seeds or the casing in which the seed would be, it's flat. There's nothing there. I can feel nothing there. They probably invested all their energy in their root system or their vegetation and rhizomes or however they spread vertically, right?
That's correct.
Swamp
smartweed does produce some seed, but very, very little, and it does it over a very long time frame. And so I'm sure there's a botanical term for this that I don't actually know, but the seed drops out of that seed head, out of the panicle, over a month or 2 months or 3 months. It's not like some of our other annual species where, boom, they grow, they've got a full seed head, and then they fall over, where at some point you can go out there and see the full seed head. Swamp smartweed always has this sort of white flower and always looks a bit sick. I don't know, like the seed head always looks half formed, because it's going to flower throughout the season.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to a different group of species here, or maybe just a group of species. I think there's probably several different types, and people are probably going to have a love-hate relationship with it. Beggar ticks. Biden's is the genus associated with this one. Talk about that's the stick tights. There's probably all sorts of different names to it, right? And so talk about that one.
Probably people just curse at this plant more than many others.
Avoid hunting in that location. Right?
That's right. Beautiful flower, bright yellow flower during late July into August. Actually, really, really pretty plant. But if you hunt in it, you've gotten that stuck, especially if you were to take a fleece jacket in there, you're throwing that fleece away at the end of the day. You're never getting all of those seeds out of there. That seed is okay. It has some value, some nutritional value, but it's not great. So I don't mind seeing.
Is it the one that's, I'm sorry, Heath, is it the one that's high in protein or is it high in fat?
It has both, but it has a pretty moderate TME value or energy value. And so I certainly don't mind seeing some Bidens in a wetland, especially because it will often grow later than many of the other species. And so after we've had better species come on and flower and then fall over, or they're still standing there, to have some Bidens come up, that's great. But a sea of yellow flowers in August, that's going to be a tough place to hunt in, and there are better food species for waterfowl.
What about pigweed is another one. It has like really small species, small seeds. Are there any other names that people would know that one by?
If you're a farmer, Palmer amaranth is one of the unfortunately is one of the pigweed species. There are also a bunch of species that we lump into pigweed, into that genus. It's a pretty decent waterfowl food, actually. The thing is, I won't say often, but it's not one that commonly find in well-managed moist soil wetlands. It's generally in drier areas, and so you'll often see waterfowl encounter that when they're getting into flooded farm fields or fallow farm fields or in a ditch or something where they can get at that. But if they can find pigweed, some of the TME studies, the energy studies that have been done with it, is it has a very high TME value. It's a little bitty seed, but a very high TME value, and boy, those plants produce a lot of seeds.
Pretty good for teal, right? Don't we find it often in teal?
That's what we think. I don't know what the diet literature says for teal, but certainly they eat a lot of seeds that size, and so I would expect that.
Okay, let's talk about a couple of species that probably don't have much foraging value for waterfowl. Coffee weed and then cinnabean or sickle pod. So kind of help me out with those. How would people recognize those? Are they good for anything from when it comes to a waterfowl standpoint?
Not very much, we don't think, from a food standpoint. So coffee weed or coffee bean, that is a species that in a moist soil wetland or really in any low area can grow 8, 10, 12 foot tall even. It's an annual plant. It produces big pods. Actually, it looks like a bean, about half the size of a pea or so for the big ones. And they're prolific seed producers, but they really haven't occurred in many of the diet studies. I was actually talking to Jacob Bethel, who's completing his master's degree at University of Arkansas at Monticello with Doug Osborne, and he's just wrapping up a diet study, and he let me know that it had occurred in his preliminary analysis in about 3% of the mallards that he had collected. So yes, it occurs. Sometimes they eat it, but for as much coffee weed as is on the landscape, which is everywhere, they're certainly not consuming it much. We have another project right now where we're force feeding it to ducks and we're going to figure out how much energy is in there. I don't know how that's going to go, but it doesn't seem like they're eating it. Again, for as much coffee weed is out on the landscape in moist soil wetlands, it doesn't seem like they're picking it up much.
When we look through the literature, there are also some of these species like coffee weed that people surmise may be used as an alternative source of grit more so than actual food, right? That's kind of been hypothesized. I don't know how we really test that, but that is what some people think. Some of these really hard seeds may actually serve more as grit than they do as foraging value, right?
That's right. There's actually the hard seed for grit hypothesis out there that a couple of people have tested. To my knowledge, I don't think anybody has shown great support for that because grit doesn't seem to be a limiting factor, right? There's grit everywhere. When we say grit, very, very small rocks and stones and things, very, very, very small that the birds will ingest, and they'll get stuck in the gizzard, and that helps grind up the hard seeds.
That's why you see doves or other birds out there on the road, on a gravel road or something, pecking, and people may be thinking, what in the world is a bird doing eating rocks? Well, it aids in their digestion in their gizzard.
That's right. Since they don't have teeth, they need something else, and that's a gizzard.
Well, what about like thermal cover? Obviously, hunters, if there's a little bit of that in a wetland, some hunters may use that as cover for us. What about ducks? Does it provide thermal cover or escape cover?
I suspect that it does, and that's just a lot of time I've spent wandering around in moist soil wetlands all across the Mississippi Valley. It certainly is a windbreak if you get in there, and most hunters probably who have hunted in a moist soil wetland with coffee bean will tell you the same thing. So I do think birds get in there for the cover aspect of it. It's another one to me like Biden's. I don't get super nervous if there's a little bit of it. I get super nervous if there's a lot of it because it can shade out other desirable species, and so a little bit goes a long way. In moderation, it's fine, but I certainly don't like to see tons of it out in a wetland.
Let's move on to the grasses. This is a group that is very important from a food standpoint. It's going to include, well, you tell us, what all's in the grasses category as we're talking about it here?
Probably what everyone is thinking. Just about anything, any of the grasses that are going to grow in your yard or you've seen in the ditch are going to occur in managed and unmanaged wetlands. This is by far the most important vegetation type that we're talking about today as far as food for a variety of different waterfowl species. Basically all forms of waterfowl, or almost all forms of waterfowl, consume grass seeds. Some of the common ones that people think about are barnyard grass or millets. There's Walter's millet and several other species of millets, but barnyard grass is one of the most common. There are a variety of different panic grasses like fall panicum, red top panicum, a variety of those. Those are all good foods. And then there are some undesirables that we don't think have really any value, like Johnson grass. We don't like to see that. That's one that you'll see on ditch banks, roadsides. We don't think that one has much value. There's a lot of vegetation material there, not a lot of seed there. So we don't like to see that one.
That Johnson grass has the growth form similar to one of the panic grasses that you're talking about.
Fall
Long
panicum.
stem, with the rather wispy top, the inflorescence where the seeds are. But Johnson grass tends to be more robust, taller, more vegetation relative to the amount of seed, right?
That's right. Yeah. And it's going to grow in drier areas. Anytime that you've got large stands of Johnson grass in your moist soil wetland, you probably need to modify your hydrology regime, right? It's too dry generally in a moist soil wetland if you're getting things like Johnson grass growing.
In terms of people's ability to identify these beneficial plants, I described it in a previous interview that I had maybe a couple of years ago, where I said something to the effect of, if you're walking through a wetland, if you're walking across a field, let's say before it's inundated, and let's say it's early in the morning and there's dew on the ground, and you're walking through there in the fall, and then you look down on your boots and it's covered with all these really small seeds. Chances are, not a guarantee, but chances are a good percentage of those is going to fall into this grass category, right? There would be some value there.
Absolutely.
What about the consistency of the food value across all the different species in this grass category? What do we know there?
Very good. So millet is one of our, again, for big species like Canada geese and mallards, those sorts of things, which are going to consume that. It's a very high TME value, or again, energy value relative to some of the other species. So we've had several TME studies. It has a value up around 2 kilocalories per gram, if you want the technical information there, whereas some of the other species will be down around 1. And so millet and some of the panic grasses have very high TME values relative to the other grass species, maybe more importantly, much higher than many of our broadleaf species. So many of like we talked about Smartweed just a minute ago, their energy values are going to be about 1 kilocalorie per gram, 1.5 kilocalories per gram, whereas millet and some of the other grasses is going to be well above 2 kilocalories per gram. So they're not only the most common out there, but also generally higher energy value, the annual species anyway, higher energy value than the broadleaf species.
Are there any of these grass species that are going to have a higher concentration of protein or fat than others? How much variation is there?
There actually is some variation there. It's more pronounced when you go to broadleaf species, and then into things like the SAV protein content comes up in the leafy material. Things like green browse and SAV, it's going to be much higher than it is in the average seed, where it's down around 10%, maybe 20% in those leafy species, give or take. In the ag seeds, I know we're going to go there, but in the ag seeds, that's where you get a ton of variation in the amount of protein that's available there. Something super high in protein like soybeans versus something like corn, where it's a bit lower.
Yeah.
But yes, there is quite a bit of variation, and not only in just the protein levels, fat levels, the fiber levels, and all of that works together to determine how digestible that food is, and ultimately what energy duck can wring out of that food.
One of the interesting observations that we made when we're talking about Canada geese and other ducks eating the seeds off of these grasses. And you mentioned that pretty much any grass that's in your yard is going to also be in a wetland. When we first moved here a couple of years ago, we have a piece of our side yard that previous owners had kept mowed, and we pretty quickly said, we're not gonna mow that as often. Actually, we don't mow it very much at all. But that first fall, as it transitioned from a sort of mowed, maybe more manicured portion of the yard to an unmowed portion, the first thing that happened was those grass species matured, headed out with their seeds, and I'm not sure it was. I don't know if it was crabgrass or Bermuda grass. I'm not sure exactly what species it was, but it attracted the Canada geese quickly. A lot of our neighbors were saying, "We've never seen this many Canada geese flocking to this yard," and they're like, "It must be because you work for Ducks Unlimited." And I said, "No, it's actually because we didn't mow the side yard, and it began to produce these seeds." And it was pretty fascinating to watch the Canada geese come in and watch their foraging behavior, because they were feeding on these plants before the seeds dropped. They would grab the seed head, strip the seeds with their bill, and that was, I'd never really seen that up close as often as I did there, but that was the repeated method of foraging that they applied across that entire side yard and turned into our front yard as well. And then I've also observed songbirds of various types, sparrows of all sorts will do the same thing, be on the ground, hop up and grab the seed head, pull it down, and just kind of pick the seeds directly off of the stem.
Absolutely. And that's a great example. I know we're into your yard, right? Not necessarily into a wetland, but that's a great example of the annual versus perennial. The repeated mowing, that's going to favor the perennial species, but when you back that off, that's going to facilitate the annual species, let them better compete. And so, there come the Canada geese.
Perfect example of that, and this is going to provide a good segue to our sedges and rushes. That same part of the yard is one that we're now trying to establish some sort of native, semi-native prairie grasses. And so part of that on our part is to do some tilling. We're just sort of doing some various experimentations out there. And after tilling portion of that yard earlier this year, I looked out there a few months ago, and it was chock-a-block full with chufa, with nutsedge. And so I, of course, got excited at somewhat sandy soils out there, and I went out and pulled it up, and sure enough, there's all sorts of tubers growing. And so it's that favoring that succession, that disturbance that favored that annual species. And if I could only hold water on that piece of property, it'd be really exciting, but it's sandy soils and it can't really do it. Plus it's part of a pipeline. They don't like that either.
Probably not.
So let's move on to sedges and rushes. Talk about those. And you can even reference the particular species that I was talking about there.
Sure. And I'll call them a close cousin of the grasses. I'm not sure that's taxonomically accurate, but from a management standpoint, grow under similar moisture regimes. Many of these are also annual species. You mentioned chufa or yellow nutsedge. It's a very good one. Sometimes it produces tubers. Sometimes it produces seeds. Sometimes it'll do a little bit of both. And it's very difficult to predict when that is going to happen. There's some thoughts on moisture regime and different times of the year and disturbance and a few other things. And I'm not very good at predicting when I'm going to see big tuber production. I think it's extremely complicated. I think soil pH probably plays in, and other soil nutrients matter a lot. And if you think about it from the plant standpoint, that plant, I hate to say that, they're thinking, right? That's personification a little bit, but that plant, physiologically, can throw resources into a tuber, into what's essentially a potato-like structure, or it can put them into vegetative production to try to hang on till the next year if it's a perennial species, or it can produce seeds. And so you've got at any one time all these individual plants going different directions and doing different strategies. And so sometimes, I'll get into a wetland and I'll see lots of tubers, dig up, get in a patch of chufa, lots of tubers there. Other times, under what seems to be similar circumstances, I see almost none. So I have no idea how to grow tubers unless you order them and plant them from the, maybe the Turkey Federation or something like that.
Am I correct that they tend to favor a bit more well-drained soils, or is that even true?
I don't know. That certainly could be true, but yeah, I've about given up my ability to predict when I can walk up to a chufa plant, dig it up. You can't just pull it up because you'll often pull off the tubers. You've got to kind of dig up the plant, and whether or not that is going to have big tubers on it or whether it's not, I don't know.
And did you know that you can actually buy those and eat them? I came across them somewhere not too long ago and bought a pack, and of course they're really hard tubers, about the size of the eraser on a number 2 pencil, and they're dehydrated. And if you're curious and want to go look into that, you could search for Nutsedge or Cyperus Esculentus. It was the exact species that we are most familiar with that you could actually buy and eat. Cyperus Esculentus, Cyperus Esculentus. I'm not going to spell the last one.
I think I saw a recipe about a year ago for roasted tubers. I don't know if that's what you saw.
That may have been. That actually probably was it. Probably not dehydrated, but roasted.
I did not try them.
They were good.
No, you tried them?
Oh, I bought them. I bought a bag and brought them in and shared them, and they were nutty. Tasty.
Sounds like we need to do a harvest in your side yard. Is what it sounds like.
Yeah, I thought about it.
And just one more thing on the sedges. I like to see those in a wetland. They certainly have value, especially some of the other ones like red root flat sedge. That's one we haven't talked about, but red root can have it's not one seed head, but it's sort of a collection of seed heads as big as a dinner plate. If the conditions are really right, it's really moist into the summer, but you also get really warm temperatures, and that soil temperature comes up, you can get really, really crazy high seed production. Now, almost microscopic seeds, they're very small, but things like green-winged teal absolutely love them, and they won't just pick up individual seeds. Sometimes these will float on top of the water, so you'll see ducks sort of skimming the top of the water, or these seeds will blow to one side of the wetland and sort of form a windrow or form a row on a shoreline, and the ducks will go get them there where they can really. Their foraging is much more efficient than these little bitty seeds having to get them individually.
There are also some species in this group that are very problematic, right? I'm thinking of deep-rooted sedge. I don't know how much of a problem that is up here, but I seem to recall it being a bit of an issue along the Gulf Coast.
I'm not familiar with that one.
And I can't recall if it's an invasive, I can't remember if it's an exotic. It definitely is invasive under the right conditions, and it was becoming a pretty significant problem in certain areas down there. Deep-rooted sedge.
Interesting.
I don't think it had high seed production, and it may be out competing some of the natives. I could be getting some of that wrong, but I know there were some of those sedges that were at least one that was of concern.
That's interesting. There's another one, rice field flat sedge, and that's one we've got you see it often in rice fields, especially the second year, or if it's fallowed or something like that. You see a lot of rice field flat sedge, and that's one we're doing a TME analysis on, or an energy analysis on right now, to see what that occurs. But that one with chufa and with red root flat sedge, those are some of the most common ones that we see, and all pretty desirable species. Again, I don't want to see a monoculture of those in a wetland because we can do better energetically, but some mixed in, especially in the low spots or late in the season when after you've done a soil manipulation or a chemical treatment or something, you can actually get a good crop of sedges in a really short time period. They have really short growing seasons, 30 to 45 days oftentimes, to produce seeds or tubers, and so they could grow really quickly. And so sometimes after you've lost a crop, or you've not had what you want, or you just had to do some management in a unit, you can get a really nice crop of sedges at the end of the growing season.
I mentioned how there are certain species in this group that are problematic. That is true in each of these different classes 100%. That we're talking about. I'm trying to recall the particular grass that's a problem up in the Midwest, and I can't. It's not coming to me right now, but I saw it all over the place whenever I was up there a few weeks back. It looks. I mean, it's a grass. You would think it. Do you think it might produce good seeds, but it's similar to what we were talking about with the perennial smartweed, where it's so much vegetation and very little seed production.
I'm embarrassed. I can't think of it. I'm thinking of the rainwater basin, and it's everywhere, but I cannot bring it to mind. Maybe
it'll come to us here before we get to the end of this.
So
let's move on here to the next category. We could spend additional time talking about different species in each of these groups. We didn't talk about teal lovegrass or signal grass when we were in the grasses. There's a whole host of things we could talk about. Trees and shrubs, and then we'll get to cultivated crops after that. Trees and shrubs, obviously the oak species are going to be top of the list here, so we'll get to those here in a minute. What about the incidental consumption, or maybe, I don't know if it'd be incidental. It seems like it'd have to be deliberate. Pecans, and they're not a wetland species, but it seems like I've recall maybe some instances of ducks maybe eating some pecans or something like that. I can imagine they would. But then also, what about species in the elms and ash that produce a lot of these little samaras, a lot of these little seeds? What do we know there?
Yeah, so as you said, oaks, number one. They're high TME value or high energy value when you're in an oak bottom, and it's their year, right? They're really producing. They can be a lot of food in a small area, or you get under a grove of trees and they're all producing in 1 year. You can have a lot of food, and again, a high TME value. So we talked about some of the grasses and sedges having a TME value of 1 to 2, or maybe up to 2.5 for some of the grasses. Most of the oak species, or the commonly consumed oak species, have a TME value that's up closer to 3 kilocalories per gram. So it's a very good food source when a duck can find that, especially the smaller species like willow oaks and cherry bark and a few of those species that are pin that are very good. We know that some of other species, you mentioned ash and maple, that produce the samaras, that those are consumed. They're not very common in diet studies, but anecdotally you see them, or you'll a diet study. I saw one recently, and overall the consumption was, I think it was maybe red maple or something, was very low, but a couple of individuals were packed full of it. So I'm not sure what to think about that. Certainly, if you've ever seen when those come off and they fall into a wetland, they're super abundant for a period of a few weeks or a month or so. And so I think a hungry mallard at some point will eat just about anything. TME wise, I don't know that we have much information on their energy value, but certainly a hungry duck will consume them.
One of the things that we talked about with Luke Naylor on a recent episode where we were discussing some of the new management regimes for Arkansas green tree reservoirs was the differential value of oak species, the acorns from different oak species. And you began to reference this, but willow oak, water oak, pin oak, Nuttall oak, I think is also another one. But then some of the other species, bur oak, maybe some of the larger white oaks are not as valuable, right? And how did we talk a little about how we learned this and how we figured this out? We talked about it on the previous episode of in the context of preference, trying to figure out if birds are preferring or selecting. And we referenced a particular controlled experiment. So talk about this. How did we learn that there are certain oak species whose acorns are preferred?
It's a good question. It's a bit of a process, like it is. So first of all, we've got to do diet studies that are proper diet studies. We see, hey, they're selecting, they're eating these more than what's available. And then to take it further, what we can do is we can really look at preference. So we can bring that study indoors and use captive mallards, captive wood ducks, as was the case in one of these studies that came out of Mississippi State under Rick Kaminsky a couple decades ago, I believe, where they had ducks in pens. I believe they were wood ducks in pens, and they fed them individual offerings of each one of these species, and then even offerings where all of the acorn species were mixed. And lo and behold, willow oak was one that the birds tended to consume more often than it was provided to them in that controlled environment. And so they really did select and even prefer those willow oak, although all of the species that they provided them were really, really good TME value. So I think one of the things that they concluded was the physical presence of those, or physical characteristics of those willow oak being a very small acorn, or having very small acorns, that probably made it a species worthy of preference there.
I think the other part of that was it was thin-shelled. All of
That's
those
right.
species that they identified as being preferred were small and thin-shelled, so the ratio of meat to shell was really high.
That's exactly right.
In contrast, and also it's easy to, I guess it was the right size for a wood duck in that case, or a mallard as well, to be able to grasp and manipulate with their bill and actually even consume, right?
That's right. And they looked at a variety of other things. As I recall, they looked at tannins, they looked at other nutrients, a variety of things. I don't recall all of those things, but you're exactly right. It's often not as simple as sometimes we make it out to be. It's a fairly complex decision process that a duck will go through.
Any other trees or shrubs that are notable food producers? And we can talk about button willow, buttonbush as a fantastic plant for cover, escape cover, thermal cover in some instances. Any other plants or any other trees that are notable as a food value?
I was going to bring that one up. Buttonbush or buckthorn or buckbrush, or name the 10,000 hunter names that it has. But buttonbush is a good one. It produces these little balls that shatter into seeds, and those are consumed by ducks. We don't think there's a ton of energy there. Certainly not given the area taken up by an individual bush. There's certainly not a lot of food there, but they certainly are consumed, especially by wood ducks. But no, not off the top of my head. The oak trees and then some of the other species, maple and ash, are certainly what you think about as the major food producers in a forested wetland.
Yeah, there really aren't many other mast-producing tree species out there. Cypress, tupelo, there's not a whole lot from those in terms of foraging value, right?
Not a lot. You get a little bit of consumption by wood ducks occasionally where they can find it, but not huge amounts of energy as far as we know.
Let's move on to the final category here. In the book, I will say you have a category related to vines. There's not really anything in there that's going to be of note, right? Like morning glory and things of that nature, but not from a food value. I mean, we can always talk about the vegetation structure and supporting invertebrate bases, things of that nature, but there's not a whole lot that really extends to waterfowl values there, is it?
No, I mean, a hungry duck in the spring will probably eat about anything that they can find. But from a foraging standpoint and an energy standpoint, none of the vine species are really desirable. They're not something we manage for. In fact, oftentimes they're things we manage against. Yeah. And so outside of just identifying them and knowing what you have and how to control it, I certainly don't put any emphasis on those.
Last group is cultivated crops. That's going to be rice, corn, soybeans, milo or sorghum, however you refer to it. What else? Buckwheat is another one.
Buckwheat, millet. I usually throw Japanese millet or golden millet in this.
What else? I mean, there's probably a host of Egyptian weed. I remember seeing from some of the earlier publications what you can, plantings for waterfowl management type thing. There's a number of those, right?
People get super creative. I've seen some literature on duck use of tomato farms and other things. But I think you covered the big ones. I would say rice and corn are probably the big ones. People
listening to this are probably going to be familiar with the value of those, the situations in which we find those, like why rice is so valuable to waterfowl. We've talked about that a lot. A lot of folks are going to be familiar with corn, both field feeding in dry situations, as well as the flooding of harvested corn or flooding of unharvested corn. Talk about, I guess, Heath, and I suppose you've already alluded to this, the main nutritional component that ducks are getting from these cultivated crops. I guess there's some variation here. So, but it's mostly energy, right? So talk about that across this different list of species.
That's correct. And I won't say that I'm necessarily advocating for crops when I say this, but I do want to be emphatic here and say that crops are the biggest bang for your buck.
That's why they're called hot crops.
That's right. Hot
foods.
That's right.
It's a bit of a controversy there, right? Hot cropping.
That's right. And again, I am not advocating necessarily one way or the other, but I will say that they have an amazing amount of energy packed into a small area, and that is just a fact. And so in areas, with agencies where we have waterfowl objectives, we've got to meet a certain amount, get a certain amount of food on the ground. They are one of our key tools in doing that. Just as an illustration, I'll talk about energy first. We talked about broadleaf plants having energy values of around 1.5 kilocalories per gram. Then we talked about some of our grasses, maybe 2.5 kilocalories per gram. Some of the agricultural crops have 3.5 to 4 kilocalories per gram. So you're talking about per gram of seed, 3 times or 4 times more energy than some of the other moist soil seed. And again, we're not talking about huge amounts of area. This is per gram of seed. So super dense energy. And there's often sometimes a myth out there too that, there's no protein in these plants. That's actually not true. There's quite a bit of protein in some of the crops. There's more in others, like soybeans, although some of it's bound up and not available to waterfowl. But some of the crops have quite a bit of protein, quite a bit of fat, quite a bit of overall energy that a bird can get out of those. Others have a little bit, but you do get a lot of the nutrients out of a crop, especially something like corn. There's a reason why we as humans eat a lot of corn. It's in a lot of our products. The same thing is true for a duck. It is a nutritious crop.
Heath, that's a great point about there actually being some other nutritional values to some of these cultivated crops. I want to jump to soybeans here and talk about it. You referenced how a lot of that protein is bound up. What's the science behind that? How much do you know in terms of how is it bound up? Why can't they utilize that protein?
We're going to need an animal physiologist or someone in here, I think, to do a good job with that. So I'm going to be very dangerous for just a second, and I'll admit that. But as I recall, there's some inhibitors, a trypsin inhibitor, I think, and so some of the amino acids can't be broken down from soybeans and some of the other crops, and so there's less of it actually available digestively to a duck. Usually what I say is soybeans are great food for ducks as long as you cook them first, just like with us. Of course, we can't go out and cook soybeans for ducks, nor would we want to, and so that's one of the problems is that they simply can't digest all of that material that's available. They can't break down those proteins unless they're heated, just like us. And so that's why I don't prefer soybeans as a managed crop. It goes beyond just the digestibility though. Soybeans, when they get wet, of course, get soft. They decompose very, very quickly. You can lose most of a soybean crop in under 30 days after it's gotten wet. And so once you've obviously flood those in a managed wetland for ducks, they're gone very, very quickly. They can also swell. You can get some impaction issues with swelling of soybeans in a duck after it consumes them. I'm not certain how big of a population effect that is, but it can certainly happen. And so I'm not the biggest fan of soybeans, but if a duck consumes them, they can certainly get some nutrients out of them.
Yeah, and contrast that with rice and corn, which actually do resist decomposition a fair bit longer than soybeans, right?
Very well, yeah. Rice is very good. I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but you can go, more than 90 days with rice and not lose most of your crop after it hits water, especially if it's still in the husk. So rice is a very good crop to leave for waterfowl. Corn is also very good, but that's often because the corn kernels remain above the water line. And so once the corn kernels are exposed to water, they're also going to decompose fairly fast. You get a lot of decomposition, but because the corn will often remain standing above the water line, but where a duck or a goose can get to that, can knock it off the cob, it's actually very good food, and it lasts a long time for waterfowl.
Are there any other cultivated crops that we need to talk about here? Well, sorghum.
Milo.
Yeah, let's do that one because I have some people talk to me about that or ask me questions about it every now and then. Is it valuable? How does it hold up to flooding? Do waterfowl like it? What do we know in that regard?
We don't know a ton. Scientifically, we don't know a ton. A lot of anecdotal information about Milo. I will say, to answer your question, how does it hold up? It holds up great throughout the winter period. In fact, that's one of my hesitations about Milo is that, if you've got a 6 foot tall, or let's just say a 5 foot tall stand of Milo, and you put a foot of water on it, it will stand all winter. And, I feel like through the next growing season. It has a really robust stalk and can grow really thickly. And so I've had the impression that maybe sometimes ducks have a hard time sort of getting into it and accessing it. That said, when they get into it, in some areas they will certainly consume the seeds. It produces a lot of seed. I want to say that it produces about 15 to 20,000 energy days per acre. So that's very good. I know we're into some jargon there, but relative to moist soil that might produce 2,000 energy days. So it produces a lot of food in a small area. Corn, double that, 30 to 40,000 energy days per acre. And so that's sort of how it shakes up against those other crops.
Heath, you and I are clearly plant and habitat and waterfowl geeks. we across these 2 episodes, we have been talking for about, an hour and a half. And I feel like I've only scratched the surface of the questions that I want to ask you. I want to ask you about habitat management and trade-offs for doing natural management for these natural grasses and sedges and other plants that we've talked about versus the cultivated crops. But we don't have time for that. We do have access to you somewhat locally here, so we will have you back sometime in the future to talk about habitat management related to some of these species. Which have we left anything out? Are there anything concluding remarks that you want to that you want to provide? I guess I will say that conversation that I talked about, the habitat management and how we incorporate all these different foods into our sort of holistic management is the logical next step for this, right? It's why this discussion is important, as we started out with. If we're going to do good habitat management, we need to know what the birds value, what they use, and so forth. And so that's been the nature of this conversation. Anything related to that we need to close out with here? I
think we've covered it. I think I'll just say, we've talked about a whole bunch of different types of vegetation, right, or vegetation communities. When we're managing for waterfowl, I'll say again, what we really want to see is a lot of annual plants, a lot of annual grasses and sedges. Some annual broadleaf plants are great because they provide some diversity in food resources, some diversity in habitat resources for insects like bees. What we really don't want to see are a lot of perennial species. We like the annual species, grasses, some of the broadleaf species that produce a lot of food for waterfowl.
Good deal. Heath, this has been a load of information, really exciting. It was good for me I enjoyed it. Could get to think about some of these plants and kind of mentally revisit some of the things that I learned during my graduate and undergraduate years. And it gives me additional things to think about whenever I'm out there in the marsh again later on. We'll certainly have you back sometime in the future to continue these discussions, but we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us again, Heath.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode. I think he's probably a 4-time guest now. He's continuing to climb the ladder. Dr. Heath Hagy with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System in the Southeast region. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for the wonderful job he does with these podcasts, editing them and getting them out to you. And then to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation. Are you okay with that, Chris?
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.